Hi, welcome to Someone Else's Movie, the podcast where an actor, writer, director, or nebulous industry figure gives a little love to a movie they didn't make. I'm Norm Wilner, senior film writer for Now Magazine, and this is the other thing I do. My guest this week is Mike Carey, a writer who you'll find working in comics, novels, and screenplays. He adapted his own book, The Girl with All the Gifts, to the screen. The result was a terrific zombie thriller that premiered at Midnight Madness at TIFF last year and is now available on iTunes and on demand, and turns up on DVD and Blu-ray in the US and Canada next Tuesday, April 25th. His new novel, The Boy on the Bridge, will be released on May 2nd in North America and May 4th in the UK. In a cool attic space over Carnaby Street in London, Mike chose L.A. Confidential, Curtis Hanson's 1997 adaptation of James Ellroy's sprawling 1990 novel. Starring Guy Pearce and Russell Crowe as two detectives who get swept up in the seething morass of corruption and retribution that is the Los Angeles Police Department in the early 1950s, it's a mammoth narrative distilled to a few personal threads, packed full of incident and character, and featuring a couple of really nasty swerves. Nominated for 9 Oscars, including Best Picture, Best Director, it won 2. Kim Basinger was named Best Supporting Actress, and Hanson and his co-writer Brian Helgeland won Best Adapted Screenplay. And 20 years later, it's as good as noir gets. This is Someone Else's Movie.
I guess I wanted to go for a movie that's one of my favourites, one that I keep going back to and keep discovering new things in. It's a movie that repays repeated watching. It's full of full of little hidden gems and charms and beauties. But also, I think it's fascinating to look at it in relation to the novel. It's fascinating to look at the production process and the decisions that they made about making it. It's something where you can talk about lots of different aspects of the film. It's just a really fascinating artifact to study, and I love it.
And as a novelist and screenwriter, it is an amazing lesson, I suppose, in what to keep and what to throw away.
Yeah, absolutely. And Ellroy himself was a huge fan. Was sort of in awe of what the screenwriters had done. He pointed out that the novel has about 8 plots, and they chose the best 3, the 3 that sort of carried the through line of the 3 main characters, Bud White, Edmund Exley, and Jack Vincennes, and sort of brought them to. He said it's 3 men working out their destiny, and they kept everything that related to that and ruthlessly cut back everything else. The novel is amazing, but it's a mess structurally. It doesn't matter. It's the way Ellroy writes.
Yeah, it's sort of ferocious ramble through historical fact and his invented fiction. And really I love that about Ellroy is that he is just screaming story at you.
Yes.
Page after page in this and in other, even in My Dark Places, which is, a memoir, he still sort of stops at points to give you 10 pages of something that he cannot not tell you about right then.
Ferocious ramble is a great way of describing it.
It's a great writing style that I have absolutely no idea how to capture.
And it's extraordinary how, obviously he's writing about a period, and he's spot on in sort of giving you the sense of that time and what was happening to LA at that time and what it was like to be there. But he's also dragging in contemporary events. So like the story starts with the Night Owl Massacre, and to some extent it plays out the consequences of this horrendous crime. Where a whole bunch of innocent people are kidnapped in a diner, dragged to the freezer at the back of the diner, and then basically just mercilessly executed. And that was a real crime, but it wasn't in period. It was happening at the time, I presume, when he was planning the novel. It's 1980 or something like that. It was a Bob's Big Boy on La Cienega Boulevard where this happened. And presumably it struck a chord with him, and he brought that into the novel. So that sort of palimpsest of past and present is fascinating. And of course that then in a different way becomes part of the cinematography of the film, part of the mise en scène, in that they only had a budget of, what was it, 35, some paltry sum really for what they were doing. And it was a period drama. So there were things they couldn't do, and they got around it by just not doing them. They found places in modern day LA that would stand in perfectly for period LA, for the LA of that time, and I think that's amazing. I bought the DVD when it first came out, and it had the best extra of any DVD I've ever bought, which is an interactive map of Los Angeles.
Yeah.
And you can click on any of the locations in the film and find out where they were really shot.
Yeah, I wish more films would do that, because especially in Los Angeles and New York, the sense of those cities. The Nice Guys is a great example. Shane Black's film last year, which recreates, mostly digitally, but recreates 1977 Los Angeles in perfect grain. I mean, he's added smog to the air. And there's the drive by the Tower Records where there's a Jaws 2 billboard that probably didn't exist there but should have.
Yeah.
And it feels like, even though none of this is real, it feels like this is the Los Angeles that we remember. And LA Confidential the film is certainly more concerned with the Los Angeles as it was. It's uglier, it's messier, no one is a hero, everything is
compromised.
Yeah, it's pulp. I mean, it's classic noir pulp imagery, but
yes.
It's also clean lines and stately frames, and there's a sense of this sort of dignity that's dying throughout the entire thing, as all the characters are gradually disillusioned even further.
Another parallel with a film I saw recently, although this is going to sound bizarre, but...
No, this is what we do. This is great.
Fantastic Beasts.
Okay.
I mean, I love that. I actually prefer it to most of the Potter films because it takes the magic into a believable, very, very beautifully realized period New York. Mm-hmm. And I don't know, there's something about sort of fascinating about forcing the magical characters to interact with ordinary people on ordinary streets. It just sort of somehow it sharpens your sense of it.
It's funny. The thing that I like the most about any of the Harry Potter movies is the third one, where Quarren finally puts them in street clothes, and you can be reminded that this is happening to real kids instead of, children in fancy robes in Fantasyland.
Instead of fairy tale characters.
They venture out into the world, other than the introduction and the occasional epilogue. I think there's one bit at the very beginning of the seventh film where they're, or maybe it's the sixth one, I've lost track, but they're flying around on Jubilee Bridge or something, Millennium Bridge, and that's London, and they never deal with it again.
Yeah.
Big magic happened, it happens.
Yeah.
Yeah, the New York of Fantastic Beasts is, other than the strange, exaggerated, stereotypical stuff that they have to do with the Muggle characters, with just the, hey, I have bagels, I'm a baker, and that kind of thing, but there's a humanity to it that's weird. I'm not as big a fan of the film, just because I found Redmayne's performance so mannered. I get it, he's decided he's a little Aspergery, but look at people, talk to people. You're supposed to be this animal tamer. At least look at the animals.
No, that's a fair point. Having said that, it's probably my favourite Redmayne performance. I'm not generally an Eddie Redmayne fan.
No, me neither.
But yeah, so the way that the city is presented, and the intelligent way that they use the city's present to tell the story of its past, I thought was enthralling. I also thought it was fascinating that what one of the early reviews said, this is the best approximation of classic noir style that has ever been realised in colour. Because it's colour palette, and they don't waste any time trying to ape the stylistic furniture of classic noir. It's actually the sort of the moral core that they're interested in. And in that respect, I think it's pretty close to perfection. I think one of the things that Curtis Hanson said about coming to work on it was that he loved the novel because it presents these utterly contemptible people, these people who, when you meet them, your first impression is, oh my God, I would stay well clear of that if I met someone like that in real life. And then it makes you understand them and it forces you to care about them. Yeah,
they are the only heroes available.
Yes.
And that's the problem of all noir fiction, I think, really. I mean, you have to have people who are morally murky to be in this world in the first place, and then those who, the classic Bogart hero who just can't look the other way. Yeah. Finally, now it all catches up to him.
And it's not even, these flawed people are presented with a challenge that they have to rise to. It's not even just, okay, this is the moment when they transcend their limitations, because actually they go down before they go up. If Bud White has one shibboleth, is that he would never hit a woman, and he's made to hit a woman. Yeah. He sees himself as the protector of women against brutal men, and he ends up beating up Lynn Bracken. Edmund Exley is incredibly buttoned up and sort of morally upright and uncompromised, and yet he's forced to break the rules in order to solve the crime. So each of them is sort of like dragged to their own nadir before they can even begin to rise, I guess.
Yeah. It's a remarkable choice, too, for Hanson at all, because nothing he'd done previously. He was such a strange career. I mean, he's not a journeyman. You sort of want to look at it that way, because he shifted genres and played around. Philip Iskov did Wonder Boys on the show a couple of months ago, and having gone back to that for the first time in, I don't know, probably 10 years at least, I was really struck by how utterly unlike LA Confidential it is, other than the attention to character.
Yeah.
It's looser, it's lighter, it's handheld half the time. There's an awareness of human frailty that's almost adoring instead of enigmatic or conflicted. I mean, LA Confidential, I don't know that... I know that Hanson and Elroy know what is right and what is wrong, but the film allows for the possibility that everything is right and everything is wrong in a way that a lot of Hanson's other films are much more direct and clear about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it stands out, doesn't it? It's an anomaly in his career.
Yeah.
It's an anomaly for quite a lot of the people involved. And it must have been a really hard sell. Do you think?
I think so. I mean, when it came to TIFF, it was almost an afterthought because it was opening the following week. This happens at the Toronto Film Festival all the time. Awards contenders will launch there, but also you'll get movies from major studios that have a nice, a cohort of famous people for the red carpet, and then open the following week. This year, what was it? Magnificent Seven opened a couple of weeks later. The Xavier Dolan film went directly in after premiering. I mean, it played at Cannes, but it came to TIFF and then opened in English Canada. LA Confidential, I want to say it screened on the Saturday or Sunday and then opened the following Friday. And no one at that time saw it as anything other than, the new film from Curtis Hanson, that could be interesting, and who are these actors that we don't know playing Americans? I mean, we knew who Russell Crowe and Guy Pearce were, but I don't think they'd had any kind of major exposure in America. And Pearce was in Priscilla, and Crowe was in Romper Stomper, but I think those were the only films that had made it out, and as I say that, I'm probably forgetting something really obvious that Crowe was in.
No, that sounds about
films,
right.
At least for American films.
And I think, there was a lot of feeling at Warner that actually this was a big mistake to put, non-Americans and unknown non-Americans in these key roles.
Yeah. No, I think Spacey was the big star.
Yeah.
And that was the lure, certainly at the festival.
On the back of Usual Suspects.
2 years later,
Yeah. But I believe that a third Antipodean actor was turned down on the explicit grounds we could not have three Australians. And it's kind of ironic because Pearce wasn't born in Australia. I think he was born in the UK and moved out there. And Crowe is from New Zealand. Yeah. So they didn't have any Australian.
Yeah, it's amazing though the way that buzz has its own momentum separate from the film. I mean, we heard about it as this troubled production, and I don't know where that started, but when it arrived at TIFF, people were sort of muttering about it, and maybe it was just because the release date was so close to the festival play date that you assume that they're just doing this for a little glamour and then spitting it out into theaters, and it did open pretty wide. Mm-hmm. But we saw it, and wow, that's not a troubled film. I mean, if the production was troubled, which I'm not aware of, it certainly doesn't show. I just don't know where the cloud came from when it arrived.
Possibly because it had been in development for a long, long time, and it had been kicking around before Hanson got to it for ages. And I think Warner's had cooled, having acquired it, they'd cooled on the property, and this idea had sort of grown up that it was unfilmable.
Well, certainly if you tried to adapt the book.
If you tried to do it faithfully, if you tried to do it sort of like scene for scene, you would, you'd end up with an HBO 10-part series. Yeah. But that reinvention, I think, is awe-inspiring. I think structurally it's wonderful. I think in terms of the coherence of its tone, it's wonderful. And where it sort of introduces new material that wasn't in the book, the obvious example being Rollo Tomasi. It works. That in a way that's a really cheesy beat. Whenever you try to describe it to a friend, you apologise for it, but it works so well in City. I think partly because the scene in which Vincennes goes to Dudley Smith and sort of pours out his heart to him, and more or less, he's sort of confessing to having a conscience at that point, isn't he?
Well, this is what I mean about the characters being forced to do right. Not the right thing, but to do right, to simply be noble, or at least upstanding, or at least not turn away.
And in the case of Vincennes, he almost feels like
he doesn't know how it's happened. Yeah, he's shocked, which is so great. I seem to have grown a conscience. What do I do?
And he goes to the one man he feels can sort of talk him through this, and it's the wrong man.
Wrong choice.
And of course, Dudley Smith doesn't. Are we allowed to give spoilers? I presume we're allowed to give spoilers.
I mean, 20 years later, if you're listening to this, you have seen LA Confidential, and if not, press pause, come back.
Dudley Smith doesn't die in the novel. He doesn't ever die at any point in the quartet. I think he ends White Jazz living out his retirement in a nursing home. He gets a happy ending.
Yeah, he's untouched.
And the way they handle that in the movie, I think, is incredible. And that it's Exley of all people who shoots him in the back, who sort of kills a suspect rather than bringing him in. Yeah. It's the perfect final beat.
Yeah, it's a movie that is full of essential noir elements, recognizable beats and tropes, and they are still felt. Like, you feel them land. The Rollo Tomassi moment, you're right, it is very silly. And I was kind of hoping there'd be another scene later where Exley starts telling the same story, and we just discover he's literally told everybody.
Right.
And so it would diffuse it a little bit. It feel less like a coincidence.
Yeah.
But it doesn't matter, because that's how noir works. And you're absolutely right. It feels totally organic in the moment. Especially, and Spacey, my God, he's so good in that little window of time from about 92 to maybe 2000, just before he started doing K-Pax and things like that, where it was, and Pay It Forward, where he just wanted to be a nice person on film for a while and missed the thing that is so elemental to him, which is that we don't want him to be nice. We want snarky, we want bitchy. And he is so great in LA Confidential because we need that flash of intelligence across his eyes before he says Rollo Tomassi, to know that he's setting him up. There's no question why that's happening in the moment, and there's, again, no exposition, no spoken dialogue. It just happens.
Yeah, it's a message in a bottle. It's the only thing he can do.
And it's such a great moment for him because he's on his way out. The big twist of the film, of course, is that the biggest star you recognize is out at this point in the movie. But, it feels like a victory.
Yeah, it does.
How did it play when you saw it?
Well, I can't go back. I can't think about the first time I saw it now because I've seen it so many times since. I mean, I fell in love with it straight away, and I must have seen it about 6 or 7 times now. Most of that initially was me sort of forcing other members of the family to go back and watch it with me.
Been there, done it.
And then every so often I'll just get it out again because it's it's one of those sort of like reliable bits of storytelling that you can always enjoy, immersing yourself in. I mean, I don't want to get sort of dragged sideways into talking about Usual Suspects, but it is astonishing that those two thrillers happened within that tiny space. I would assume that Hanson and Helgeland were already working on the screenplay for LA Confidential when Usual Suspects hit, although I'm sure they approached Spacey because of Verbal-Kind. But
Suspects was, I'm trying to remember if it was at Sundance or at Cannes, but it definitely played before it opened in August of 95 in the States and came to TIFF back when they were still doing that, when they were willing to play films that had already opened in their native countries, even if it was America. So Spacey seemed to break then, and then Seven came out right around the same time and exploded. Mm-hmm. But I'm just in my head, I'm sure Helgeland and Hanson would have known they wanted him before that opened.
Okay.
Or maybe they saw an early, I mean, it's certainly possible they saw an early version of it. Polygram wasn't shy.
But they're two of the finest thrillers ever to be made, I think, thriller movies ever to be made, and they're completely different in terms of tone and style, and in terms of the whole approach to the storytelling. There's a layer of cleverness and metatextual cleverness to Usual Suspects that's
playful, isn't it?
It's very playful, yeah. I mean, the whole thing kind of deconstructs itself at the end, so that you're left with nothing but that the sort of final beat of him walking to the car, and then you sort of reflect on what you've just seen and think, well, how much of that was ever true?
Yeah. For a while, I was convinced that you could make the argument that Benicio del Toro didn't exist, that Fencer isn't real, that he's just made up, which is why we can't understand him. Because he doesn't survive. He's not on the boat. He's out of the story before Verbal is captured. Yeah. And so you can invent whatever you want for that because there's no way to back it up.
True.
But then I realized, of course, that he would have been in the lineup, so there's some evidence of it in the initial lineup. That's got to be
okay. Yeah,
that's a thing that has a piece of paper connecting to Verbal. But then I decided that it was simply because Kaiser Soze just doesn't care about him. because he's not important to his story. He really has no function in the plot other than to be intimidating once or twice. And so the fact that he doesn't have any real discernible dialogue, I imagine that in Soze's mind it's hand waving. He's like, he said something. And we see it, and we all accept it. The audience just buys it.
Yeah.
And then you go back and wait, well, hang on, that could actually be one of the most ingenious meta choices for the narrative. I mean, I've never, damn it, I've interviewed Singer twice. I've never asked him about it. But I'd love to know when that started. I mean, is it Del Toro just being difficult and then deciding, I don't care about any of this. I'm going to deliver it like it doesn't matter because I'm above it, or is it all in the text? Was it part of the script?
That's fascinating.
Oh, I have to follow up. McQuarrie, if you're listening,
somebody asked Pete Postlethwaite a couple of years later, so was your character Kaiser Soze? He said, I have no idea. You can kind of read it any way you like. It's that open.
Yeah, we just know it's not Gabriel Byrne.
But I love the moment when Benicio del Toro is reading out the line,
yes.
Give me the money, motherfucker, or whatever it is. And the guy who's sort of like talking to them from off screen says, in English, please. And Benicio del Toro for a moment looks really hurt, like that one went home.
Yeah. Oh, that played so beautifully in the theater. These movies, people are going to discover them on disc alone, and it's such a different relationship to the big surprises, the big shocks. I mean, it's inevitably someone will say, "Oh, that wasn't that big a deal," and you don't know what it's like to watch a movie with 500 people who have just had the air knocked out of them. And it's Spacey's exit in LA Confidential. Even Bud's first act of violence was genuinely shocking when you see that come out of Crow. And I had seen Romper Stomper, and I knew him from that. And it's like, okay, I know he can be violent, but the hurt in his eyes is something new.
And the scene where he hits Lynn Bracken and then realizes what he's done. If it's a man in free fall, it's brilliant, absolutely brilliant.
Yeah, and it's rare that you see. I mean, this is Casablanca, this is The Maltese Falcon, all the essential noirs where someone violates his own code. We've seen that a million times, but we've never seen it with an emotional rubber band action where, as soon as the violence is committed, you can see how sorry he is. That's something that Crow brought, and I was really almost surprised to see it come out of him.
Yeah, but the film is littered with those moments. I think there's not a single scene that isn't a set piece. It's like that's the wrong way of putting it. But you know how a lot of thrillers, and including Usual Suspects, will build up to a moment, will build up to a kind of a core. Yeah. LA Confidential is all core.
Yes.
Pretty much from start to finish. There's not a single dud beat. There isn't a single thing that hasn't been thought through and sort of polished to a fine gloss.
Yeah, it's an exquisite work of adaptation, and it's also just a really good movie. You can go and read the book later and see all the stuff that was
cut out,
and it's a monster. I mean, it's a huge read, but it's satisfying in a completely different way because now you have background, now you have data, now you have all the facts.
And the rest of the cast. Yeah. This is playing out against a much bigger backdrop.
Yeah, the room gets bigger.
And of course the span of time. It's like the novel covers most of a decade. Mm-hmm. And that is only a chapter in the bigger story of the quartet.
So how familiar were you with Elroy's work when you saw the film?
Not at all. Not at all. That was what brought me to Elroy.
I think I had read My Dark Places, but that was it. Or maybe, no, that's probably right.
And I'm still not. I don't read much in the way of thriller. Mostly when I read genre for pleasure, I'll read fantasy, sci-fi, horror. Yeah, that's my comfort zone. About Howard Chaykin in Norway.
God, I love his work. Norway.
In Norway, at the Rafters convention, Chaykin was genuinely shocked by how ignorant me and Mike Collins were. He said, I don't actually want to share this panel with you guys. I want you sit over there, and I'll do my own little panel over here. But afterwards, he gave me a list of stuff that I had to go away and read. Some of which was just excellent. I was introduced to Dennis Lehane through that, and Don Winslow. Power of the Dog, I think, had just come out, and Chaykin said, if you read one thing from this list, read Power of the Dog. It also had the Jack Reacher novels on it, and when I next met Chaykin, he said, "So how are you getting on with the box?" I said, "Dude, I can't get on with Reacher." He said, "You fucking degenerate."
I'm not a fan either. I think it's just my problem with the Jack Reacher novels and the films as well, by extension, is that you create someone who can't be beaten, and therefore there's no tension. He's going to fix this, whatever it is.
Absolutely. And coming back to Logan, the wonderful thing about Logan is that he's totally vulnerable in it. You've seen him as the invulnerable killing machine, and now you see him as an old man who's kind of losing it, kind of on the brink of falling apart.
Yeah.
And then this, since we're talking about adaptation, there's a very interesting kind of weaving together of different stories from the comics. It's obviously sort of loosely inspired by Mark Millar's Old Man Logan.
Yeah.
But X-23 doesn't figure in there. She's been brought in from a different storyline. Donald Pierce and the Reavers are coming from somewhere else. So someone is like cherry picking their favorite X-Men.
Yeah, and it's remarkable to see that when a year ago we saw, some idiot attempt to stitch The Dark Knight Returns and Death of Superman together. And you needn't comment on this. I'm angry enough for both of us. It just felt like someone at some point really loved those stories and wanted to do them right, and then this is what happened. And
it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, at the moment, the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and I know the X-Men movies aren't, they're Fox, it's a separate entity, but the Marvel franchises seem to be so right, seem to be being handled so deftly.
Yeah.
And DC just, although they've got these great properties, these great characters, have yet to find a way to express them on film, with a few exceptions, in a way that coheres and has the sort of the grandeur of the comics. I mean, I think comics are fascinating because they're sort of hugely sprawling, interconnected stories. They have a kind of they just have a vastness and complexity that is very difficult to bring to film and TV. But Marvel is sort of managing to do it. In the past, what's happened is you had a movie franchise, and they never moved more than 2 movies away from the origin, and then it's like panic. Have to get a new actor in, so you have to retell the origin story and start again from scratch. So you never got to the point where the stories were sort of playing off each other. And now with things like the Avengers, and the Iron Man Civil War and so on. Was that an Iron Man or Captain America? Captain America
but it
Civil
might
War.
as well have been an Iron Man because they know how valuable Downey is.
Yes, you're starting to get that kind of that kind of sense of the stories coming together and moving through each other, which is what I love about the comics.
Yeah, and if you still want to make a Doctor Strange where no one else interacts at all, except for the Stinger, where Thor shows up because somebody has to, because that's how these movies work, you can have a fully contained origin story that doesn't depend on the rest of it, but still I mean, it's Iron Man with magic. It's the same story. Wounded genius becomes superhero.
The other thing I loved about it, so I'll come back to LA Confidential in a second, but I loved that they actually used, in a way, in a very strange way, they went back to Ditko's way of showing magic as a physical force that you can see moving between people. And, Ditko has, when Strange fights Mordo, it's like battering rams made of magic and shields made of magic, and it's like there's a visceral physical quality to it, and they got that across really well. I thought. I mean, they modernized it, but they stuck to the idea of it.
Yeah, whoever came up with the idea of pinch zooming for magic, because it is instantly understandable to an audience that's been using smartphones for 10 years.
Yes.
You can make something bigger or smaller by doing this with your hand. And of course you can. We do that every day. It's just magic now. It's ingenious. And they've been kind of working towards it with Tony Stark's touchscreens in all the movies. There's a moment in, I think, the second Avengers movie where he flips a piece of data from a screen to another screen and just does it. And then you see Cumberbatch do it in Doctor Strange. Like, that's the same move. They've just found a new context for it.
That's true.
They're teaching us how to watch these movies before they even make them.
That's kind of awesome, isn't it?
Yeah, it really is.
So there were meant to be 2 different sequels to LA Confidential.
Yeah.
I mean, they tried it out as a TV series.
Speaking of franchises.
I haven't seen the pilot. Apparently there's a newer version of the DVD, because I've still just got the one that came out in 1998.
Yeah. Is it on Blu-ray, do you think?
It must be now, I would think. But so you can now get the pilot as a sort of extra feature on the DVD, but I haven't seen it.
No,
but Hanson and Helgeland were meant to be working, before he died, they were meant to be working on another movie, weren't they, which would
Was it another adaptation of the book?
No, it was nothing to do with Elroy at all. Apparently, part of the original deal was that the new Regency would then own those characters.
Oh, of course. Well, it's the same way Fox ended up with the X-Men, right?
Yeah,
they kept
I
certain
guess.
pieces.
I wonder how Elroy feels about that deal. But so yeah, they were able to they were theoretically able to take the characters forward in a way that had no relationship to the books at all. They could just do their own thing with them. So I think that was the plan, to take Exley and White on another outing.
I wouldn't worry about. I mean, I understand that these stories are sequential. You're allowed to make more of a thing, but the whole point of LA Confidential is that this is their greatest challenge, right? So any sequel is going to feel less epochal, less important, potentially. Yeah. I mean, you challenge yourself with coming up with a big enough story. It's the Jack Reacher problem. Well, he defeated Werner Herzog in the first one. How do we fix this? What's more scary than Werner Herzog without his fingers?
Yeah, no,
quite a few things, I suppose.
But yeah, you're right. I think it would have been difficult to find a second story that was the equal of the characters, that sort of put them on their mettle in the same way. Because basically they've just been through the fight of their lives, and they've found out who they are in the process, and have to live with that in all the sort of many and various ways.
And the case embodies so many things about Los Angeles and racism and the legacy of the city's police department that a second case of that magnitude would maybe be on the nose. It would be too much, too obviously representative of something. It would feel like a screenwriter working out a problem rather than... I mean, I'm just guessing. But it feels like it would be hard to do another one.
Yeah, it would be much easier to do it badly than to do it well. I think, sorry, this is jumping around a bit, but one of the other things, I was reading up on the film prior to coming in today, and I was reading about how Guy Pearce got into role. Curtis Hanson thought it would be a great idea if he actually work shadowed some LA cops, and that did not work out at all. He didn't like them as people. He found them very, very hard to like. The guy he was particularly partnered with was openly racist, and they got into a number of arguments, and finally Pierce decided he would just look at older movies set in LA, and sort of he said it was really useful because if you look at sort of cop thrillers of the 1930s and 40s, he said there was a woodenness to the characters which was just right for Exley, because he's got that kind of that humorless focus, which is kind of like it's one half sort of ambition to live up to his father's legacy, and one half kind of doing it by the book, and the two things just work really nicely.
I mean, I thought casting Pierce was a fascinating choice because as a bodybuilder, that's how he started, he doesn't look anything like a person would have looked in 1940 anything.
No.
There's this story of an actor who worked with Branagh on Frankenstein saying that it was very strange to see the film and have so many scenes of a shirtless man running around with muscles that didn't exist in the 19th century. You had to be, you Nautilus those things. You can't just make them through effort.
Yeah.
Same with Nate Parker in The Birth of a Nation. He's supposed... Yes, the argument is that he's playing Nat Turner, who was a slave and did a lot of hard manual labor, but he's lighting his six-pack in the film, and it's just this strange instant distraction from what the story is about.
Yeah, it's an anachronistic six-pack.
Yeah, and because you don't see Exley without a shirt on, or I think there's an undershirt, a vest at one point, but because you never really concentrate on his body, he just looks tense and coiled because he's got no fat. His body is so lean that he looks like he's consuming himself from the inside.
Yeah,
in his moral rectitude.
It's a great look for that character. Yeah.
I was just, and Bud is a little doughy, and Crow let himself puff a bit, and you see a kind of weariness in him that you wouldn't see necessarily it certainly wasn't present in Romper Stomper, but the physical transformation as well as the emotional performance. There's something different about that character, and you put them together and you have this tiny little wiry man next to this beefier, angrier man. He's at least, the contrast is instant and immediate, and it's just wonderful. And then now I'm thinking of Crow and the Nice Guys, who's like twice his size in LA Confidential, that he was in LA Confidential.
Yeah.
And it's just this great comment on that character.
I was thinking as you were talking about anachronistic nudity, I love the Colin Firth, Jennifer Ely, Pride and Prejudice,
oh, yes.
the BBC one. But there's a moment in that when Colin Firth, coming home to Pemberley, decides to stop off and have a swim in the lake.
Yes.
And he strips off.
That's what people wanted.
To the waist. And I can remember sitting on the sofa with my wife and saying, that's not in the novel. And then said, I do not give a damn.
Right. And every woman I know would argue that it should have been
Yeah.
in the novel, that it's essential. So many crushes were formed in that lake.
But it's the markers for physical intimacy. A lot of modern adaptations of Jane Austen will have the characters kiss, for example, and the lovely Ang Lee Sense and Sensibility ends with a kiss between the male and female leads, and of course it's just wrong. They would never do it in a public place.
Yes, exactly.
They would barely ever touch in a public place.
Perhaps a subtle hand holding in a carriage.
Yeah.
But nothing that might, Yeah, it's true. I mean, Love and Friendship captures that really well. The
Yes.
still in the film. When it ends, it's simply people in a room agreeing to be happy, which is sort of a nice way to go. Read or I married him, that sort of thing. It's just we're gonna skip past all the unpleasant physical contact.
The sort of the most satisfying emotional moment, I think, in the Ang Lee movie is the moment when she realizes that the brother who's married is not the brother that she wants, and therefore that she still has a shot at. And she just bursts into tears. She just bursts into hysterical tears and runs out of the room because she suddenly realizes she has a future, or she has a chance at a future. That's a great moment.
Yeah. It's the possibility of happiness. It's something that keeps coming back on this show.
Which of course, is how LA Confidential ends as well. With both Exley and Bud White in perhaps in ways they didn't expect, getting their heart's desire, getting what fleur-de-lis promises, whatever you desire. Exley gets to be in the detective division, having previously been told by Dudley Smith that he really needs to be somewhere else.
Right. Well, he removed that obstacle.
Yes,
so,
true.
There you go.
And Bud gets gets the girl.
Yeah.
So
and has to live with it.
Yeah, it's a beautiful ending.
I haven't even mentioned Kim Basinger's name, and she won the Oscar for the performance, and it was a surprise, I think, to see her taken seriously in cinema again, because she hadn't been for a very long time. I mean, the early 90s were not her best window.
No.
And Hanson casting her is almost as important as Hanson casting Spacey, to sort of be the audience draw, and at the same time to legitimize her performance in the way that he did with all the Veronica Lake stuff. It's really complex and interesting, and I was honestly surprised to see Basinger do it, because she hadn't seemed interested in complex and interesting for the longest time. So that's the other real surprise to me, is that you come out of this film with this new appreciation for someone who she wasn't necessarily a joke, but she wasn't making good movies for a very long stretch of time. She and Melanie Griffith were sort of competing for worst big budget blockbuster roles.
Yeah. And
then all of a sudden, you have to take her seriously again. You're forced to take her seriously within the film.
And she is such a crucial part of the film, I think. And it's the one respect. Well, no, it's not the only respect, but it's one significant respect in which I think LA Confidential is superior to Usual Suspects. Usual Suspects has a very instrumental view of its female characters.
Yeah, they barely exist.
They barely exist, and where they do exist, they exist as levers to be used against the men. And that beat is hit again and again. And I think, Kim Basinger's role in LA Confidential, it's pivotal. It's relatively little screen time, but she is. Her story weaves in and out of Exley's and Bud White's in a way that is absolutely thrilling. And apparently, I'd forgotten this, but that doesn't happen in the novel either. It's Inez Soto, the woman who's raped,
right,
who becomes a sort of romantic bone of contention.
Okay, so they just sort of harmonize the characters.
Yeah, and I think it's incredibly watchable, incredibly powerful, and of course it builds up to that moment when Bud realizes that she slept with Exley as well, and it's a turning point for him. God, and then you immediately go to the fight, don't you? The fight in the records room, where he almost beats Exley to death.
Which you, again, need. You have to have that violence between them, because even though it is the standard buddy beat where, we hate each other, then we love each other, it's ugly and it's mean and there's no honor to it, and Exley is just pulped. There's no competition either. There is no question as to who's going to get the better of the other. And it's the kind of thing where I just imagine people who'd never seen Russell Crowe in a movie before trying to figure out what's going to happen. Because you don't know these guys that well. They're probably going to survive, but who knows? At this point, there's so much blood in the film that all bets are off. It could be that nobody wins.
And so coming back to Kim Basinger, she got one of only 2 Oscars, didn't she? That the film
screenplay.
got. The other one was screenplay. It was up for many, many more.
I think 8 in total. I'm probably wrong about that. It might have been 9, but it was 1997, and it was steamrolled by Titanic.
Yeah.
Canada will never forgive it for taking screenplay away from Adam McGowan for The Sweet Hereafter, but let's face it, that wasn't going to happen.
But then it immediately after sort of being relatively snubbed at the Oscars, I think it went from strength to strength in terms of critical reception.
Mm-hmm.
It ended up being named repeatedly on Best of the Year list and then on Best Ever lists.
Yeah. Well, this happens all the time. People don't respond immediately to a genuinely original treatment of something. They're thrown back. They're Kiss Kiss Bang Bang. Just to go back to Shane Black, took 5 years to be taken serious, to be properly appreciated, and yet it's the reason that Downey's comeback started. Everybody said Iron Man. It's like, no. If you look at Kiss Kiss Bang Bang, that's the role that got him into the Marvel universe. That's what made it possible.
And that almost sank without trace here.
It did. Again, came to TIFF, barely released. Warner again. Warner Brothers. I don't know. They tried, but it's the kind of movie, LA Confidential specifically, is the kind of movie that you need a second viewing of to appreciate what it gets right. The first time, you're just in awe of what it does.
Yeah.
And then watching it again, you can see the pieces moving and understand how, especially if you know the book, which I came to afterwards. I was just dazzled by how much had been, not how much had been left out, but how much had been worked in.
Yeah.
And formed into a cinematic narrative.
He said, Hanson said to one of the production crew, this is a crappy anecdote because I can't remember who he was talking to, but he said, I want all of this and this and this, I want all of this detail present, and I want it way in background. And I think that was his approach throughout, just to sort of create this incredibly rich texture, but not to let it detract from the characters, to constantly come back and come back and come back to the core cast.
But that's what makes it so interesting, is the sense of life going on everywhere, that there is so much more happening that they can't interact with. There's just no time.
Yeah.
And their focus is on this case, which makes it even more obvious that, it brings their obsessions into play, because if you don't have time for the rest of the world, then whatever you're chasing must be the most important thing.
I think in terms of reception, Hanson made a very smart move in exhibiting at Cannes. Which I think was him, not Warner, that made that decision. Yeah,
they very rarely bring things there.
Because their point of view is, if you're running the risk of losing, and if you lose, then you're a loser. Why take the chance at all? And of course, it was received extremely well. So it had that momentum behind it when it had its US release.
Yeah, the French would have loved it anyway. I mean, it's a complex American narrative that interacts with cinema as history.
Yeah, so, and they sort of share the credit of inventing noir, don't they?
Yes, exactly. And certainly they take all the credit for it, really. They've earned it. But the response was coming out of there, became, this is something to watch, this is something to be ready for. And then when it came to TIFF, the scheduling of the theatrical release seemed to take the wind out from under it. I still don't understand why. But 20 years later, no one's arguing with with its place in the canon now.
No.
It would be very difficult to find someone who doesn't think it's all that good. It's a remarkable piece of adaptation and structure. I really like revisiting it.
It would be one of the movies I took to a desert island, assuming that the desert island had electricity so I could play DVDs.
Yeah, I figured I would just rig a bicycle of some sort to power it. Yeah. We have to have that.
Or 1,000 hamsters in a wheel.
Sure. But they get caught up in the movie. They'd stop. The final question on the podcast is always the same and oddly pertinent here. What of LA Confidential have you borrowed, referenced, stolen, incorporated into your creative DNA? Is there anything that you might have used in terms of adaptation?
Not in terms of adaptation. I think the inspirational thing about it, or one of the inspirational things about it, is that it's just luminous in terms of making the characters front and center and making everything depend on the character journeys, the character arcs. it's so easy. I think it's certainly easy if you've got a background in writing monthly comic books, as I do, to get hung up on plot mechanic. And the moment you lose sight of the characters, you are lost. And LA Confidential is a film that never for a single second loses sight of that.
Yeah. And as far as the, I'm sorry, I blanked on the title, The Boy on the Bridge. The Boy on the Bridge. I keep saying Boy with Bucket, and I know that's not right. That's an old...
That's the third book in the trilogy.
It's an old Emo Phillips, Stephen Wright joke. I like to go to the art gallery and name all the untitled paintings. Boy with Bucket. So how do you... Because that book, as I understand it, having not read it, is related to the existing work, Girl with All the Gifts. They are at least in the same general space.
Yeah, it's that. It's another freestanding. It's a freestanding novel set in the same world. Okay. It's not quite a prequel and it's not quite a sequel because it starts before Girl with All the Gifts and it finishes after.
Okay.
But it's very much playing in that same sort of sandbox, and I think it sort of it comes at the same events from a different angle. It kind of illuminates them in a way that I think will be pleasurable for people who've read the first novel, okay. But you can read it completely by itself.
Okay, it's just such an interesting structural, conceptual challenge to go back in when the story you've already told is intentionally so self-contained.
And of course you get to the end of Go With All the Gifts, and my publishers were quite keen for me to do a sequel. They said, quite early on, would you consider doing a sequel? And I pointed out that if I did, it would be a different genre.
Yeah.
It wouldn't be a zombie novel. It would be a political novel about building a new society. It would be about education and infrastructure, and
Well, we need more of those right now.
But people who liked the first novel would not necessarily have come back for that. So I started thinking about, well, what could you do? And I thought, in the negative spaces of the first novel, there's another story. It's the story of Rosie, the big armoured laboratory that they find almost empty. It's kind of like Marie Celeste. There's one corpse in the cabin. So it's the story of Rosie's crew and what happened to them, but it also ends up being the story of an unexpected aspect of Melanie's world, which ends up shaping the future.
Oh, great. I can't wait to read that.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
My thanks to Mike Carey, whose new novel The Boy on the Bridge comes out May 2nd in the US and Canada and May 4th in the UK. You can watch The Girl with All the Gifts on demand now, but I'd suggest picking up the Blu-ray when it comes out next Tuesday. The supplements are pretty fantastic. And if you're in the UK, it's been available on disc for some time now. You can find Mike on Twitter at MichaelCarey191, all one word with numerals for the numbers. And you can find LA Confidential on Blu-ray and DVD from 20th Century Fox Home Entertainment or Warner Home Entertainment, depending on where you are in the world. And yes, the Blu-ray does include that TV pilot. Kiefer Sutherland played the Spacey role. It's weird. As always, you can find me on Twitter at Norm Wilner and elsewhere on the internet at nowtoronto.com. You can also find this podcast on Twitter at Semcast, S-E-M-Cast, and on the web at someoneelsesmovie.com. If you want to leave a review on iTunes, that would be very kind of you. Feel free to mention Rollo Tomasi. I'll understand. Thanks for listening.
I'm afraid you're just too darn loud.